Hello, welcome to the Principles of Macroeconomics. My name is Oleg Ivanets. I'm gonna be your instructor for this course. The way course is structured, you will have a number of video lectures, and each lecture is supported by PowerPoint slides that you can find on Lima. So you go to Lima, download the slides for the particular lecture, and follow the slides along with listening to this video lecture. That will be the best possible way to approach the material. Some external materials, the links will be provided in the lecture slides, so make sure you check them. And so let's start. We can start from the introduction. That is lecture 1, so you can download slides for that on Lima and follow me with the slides. So first I would like to introduce myself a little bit broadly. My name is, as I mentioned, Oleg Ivanets. You can call me Professor Oleg. I'm originally from Ukraine, where I got my master's in economics in 2006. After that, I worked for 4 years in investment industry, in particular in private equity, which is funds that buy larger than 50% of a company. So if you are not familiar with investment industry, we have two parts, major parts. We have investment banking, where we invest in stocks and bonds, and we have private equity, where we invest in actual companies. The difference is in the share you buy. So when you buy stocks, you usually buy little bit of a company, particularly less than 25% considered to be a minor investor, and that is related to investment banking. Everything that you buy more than 25% gives you a significant share, and that's related to private equity. So I was working in private equity. It's very fascinating industry, and then global financial crisis happened in 2008, and it motivated me to study macroeconomics and basically work as a macroeconomist. So I switched to investment banking, which are usually larger institutions, and they have a position of macroeconomist. I had that unique position for 3 years, and the more I was working as a macroeconomist, I realized there are a lot of gaps in this field, so I decided to do my PhD in University of Hawaii. And as I had quite a lot of practical experience, I also became a lecturer almost immediately, well, 1 semester after I took PhD. So I was for quite a long time I was lecturing University of Hawaii. And this semester I got a professor job in Drew University, which is in New Jersey. So I'm actually right now in New Jersey. The weather is far not that nice as in Hawaii. In particular, it's actually really hot outside and humid. But there are other benefits, and the university where I'm currently working is quite nice. It's a small university, more personal approach, but at the end the material is quite the same. And so let's go to macroeconomics. First thing is a definition. What are we studying in our Principles of Macroeconomic course? First, we have a broad definition, which is a typical definition of macroeconomics. It's a science that studies how entire national economies operate, how US economy operates, how Japanese economy operates, and other countries. Also how a global economy operates, but it's another discipline, but it's based on macroeconomics. So A little heads up, macroeconomics is a foundation for many other fields, and I'm going to mention this in this lecture in particular. But this broad definition brings a lot of confusion about what we actually study, because there are different approaches to study how the economy operates and what particular questions are relevant and what are not. And so I find this broad definition quite confusing, specifically about what we're going to talk about. So there is a focus definition, and it sounds like macroeconomics is a science of what government should do or should not do to run the economy in the best possible way. And it brings certain practical perspective. So now we are not just asking random questions about the national economy. We are focused on what government can do to improve the economy, to run the economy in the best possible way. And there are certain things that government should do, but also there's certain things the government should not do. And that's kind of problematic, and honestly, we don't, as an economist community, we don't agree on many things. And in this course, we'll see that even though there is a dominant theory, there are a lot of problems with this dominant theory, and a lot of current issues that you hear in the news, if you follow the news, political issues are based on problems with macroeconomics. And that's part of motivation for me personally to do research in this field and to be a macroeconomist, because there are huge problems that are relevant to all of us. Trade, we have employment, unemployment problems, we have political division based on these economic issues, and all those things are very relevant because economists didn't do their job very well. And so I'm, as a new wave of economists, try to bring more practical vision of macroeconomics and to help to resolve those issues. So in this course, we not just asking random questions about entire national economy, but we are quite focused on what government should do or should not do. Second thing, as you may see in your slide, is economic methods. Now, there are two major economic methods that are used. First is mathematical modeling. It's a key method of what is called mainstream economics. We're gonna learn a little further that there are two schools of economics. There is neoclassical or mainstream, and there is a new economic thinking which is more realistic and kind of based on economic analysis. So you can see economic analysis is another method, and it means that we apply economic theory to various data with a specific purpose, such as explanation or forecasting. Now, those methods give completely different results, and that's part of a problem. Sometimes they give the same result, but in most cases, actually, they don't, especially nowadays, as we'll see. Our current economy is very different from the economy that was 50 years ago, when the theory, particularly mainstream theory, like crystallized. And I see that the main problem behind the problems that we have, the fundamental issue is that our economy has changed dramatically for the last 50 years, but our economic theory hasn't changed at all for that 50 years. And that drives those problems that we can all relate about environment, about trade, about all other things you hear in the news. And This course is mostly about economic analysis, but I also want to warn you about your future career because um, if you're an economic major, if you're planning to be an economic major, you'll require to take advanced macroeconomics, and it will be heavily linked to mathematical modeling. Also, it depends on professor. Uh, Again, I'm quite practical, so even my advanced macro class is more about economic analysis, but some other professors are more mainstream, so they put more focus on mathematical modeling. So for this course, luckily, you don't need pretty much any math, but it doesn't mean that for macro 300 you won't need any math. You actually will need some mathematical modeling skills and equation and sometimes taking derivatives. And if you're planning long term to go to masters in economics, then you will need a lot of calculus and a lot of math modeling skills. So just to warn you that whatever we study here is just a beginning, but it's designed for everyone. It's not designed for economics major. It's designed for general audience, so you can relate and do basic economic analysis. But if your target is economics major, you need to be quite aware about that is a very math intensive discipline these days. But for this class, you don't need to worry. So let's move forward, and I'm not sure if you have taken microeconomic class. Sometimes students take it before macro. It's not required, but of course it helps a little bit. What I would like to tell you about the difference between micro and macro. Now, obviously, microeconomics studies certain small questions like firm-related questions. So they're focused in on firms. What firms do, how they make profit. Well, at least that's what microeconomics should study. But and macroeconomics study the entire country. This leads that you may relate, your parents' work, your family work. Most of people are not concerned with what country is doing. Most people, as well as most economists, they're concerned with some micro questions. So statistically, like 95% of economists are doing microanalysis. And we are quite advanced in that field. But macro analysis is something that you don't need until there is a crisis. And when there is a crisis, then none of your microeconomic research will help you to deal with a crisis. That's where macro comes. And I have a little illustration with a manager of a fisher boat. So if you manage, a fishing company, most of your time, if you're a manager, most of your time is dedicated to these micro questions, where to send your boat to catch the best, fish, the most optimal amount of fish, where to sell fish, on what market, at what time, and so on. But your macro would be your weather forecast, and you usually check it. Oh, weather is nice, that's it. You check it like a minute. If it's nice, you send your boat. But if you forget to check your weather forecast and you send your boat, you might lose your entire business. And that's how macroeconomics work. When everything is fine, you basically just check it, spend a minute. Sometimes, and that happened a lot in our history in pretty much all the countries, if the weather, economic weather, is good for quite a while, people stop checking it. People forget that it matters, and then the crisis comes. The storm comes, everything is destroyed, and then you start asking, well, how could it happen? Why no one warned us? how such huge storm could happen without any warnings. And you can go on the next slide and see that the time we live now is basically after the greatest storm in 21st century already, but if you take the 100 last years, that was the greatest storm after basically 1929. So not exactly 100 years, so we're around like 80 years. So for the 80 years we had the major economic storm in 2008, and it played not just destroyed a lot of jobs and a lot of people got hurt, a lot of savings got lost in that crisis, but for us as economists, it changed a lot of macroeconomic perspective, because it wasn't just a random crisis, something that was not predictable or something that we could, like a storm that recently hit Hawaii. We are aware that storms are possible. So when it was announced that our storm is coming, it wasn't some kind of surprise, and then luckily it wasn't that massive, so I hope you all survived it and you're safe. But that wasn't something extraordinary. With crisis in 2008, the mainstream economic theory basically denied that its possibility. It's something happened that was impossible. It was impossible to happen, but it happened. And it didn't, again, it wasn't something random from natural cause. It was a man-made designed crisis, not on purpose designed, but it was a man-made crisis here in the United States that affected the entire world. And that affected the entire economic science, because even now, 10 years after, we don't have really clarity what to do with that. And there are a lot of contradictions, because the old theory says that was impossible, and then they switch to something that, well, it's something like, like a perfect storm. 10 different events happened at the same time, created this crisis, but it still is not satisfying for me personally, and for a bunch of even top economists, Nobel laureate economists, they disagree with this. They see that there is a fundamental flaws in the theory that we use, that those crises were actually quite predictable. And for me as a practitioner, that makes more sense, because if you ask anyone from Wall Street experience, of course they were not aware about the exact date of the crisis and how it play out, but there is a feeling, and practitioners are not that in denial of the possibility of a crisis, because it kind of makes sense. If you actually trade stocks or you invest money, you learn that there are ups and downs, and all that theoretical simplifications that we have are not working in the real world. So this course will be a lot about these two sides. We have a simplified view that you can find in textbook, and that's partly why I don't use textbook for this book, for this class, because it's not very helpful. It gives you just simplified reality, but also it gives you that simplified reality in a very complicated way in math models. So you think you master something, complicated, but in fact it's a very simplified reality that is not working. So aftermath of this crisis is this new approach to look at the data, to look on the analysis, to have different ideas, to have a little bit of theory, but also to have an idea how you can bring data to this, bring actual facts, and fact check the theory. So the next slide gives you a little extension on this. So we'll have a mainstream part of the theory and a realistic part that basically is a critics of that theory. For almost each lecture we'll have these two parts. And the last part of the introduction is those courses that are based on macroeconomics. Some of them you might, as I mentioned, international economics, that might make basically direct sense, because if we study national size economy, so if you want to understand how countries trade, you probably should know how countries operate, so you should know macroeconomics. But what is rarely acknowledged or realized until later, that macro is based for a bunch of business courses, particularly monetary economics. It's actually part of macroeconomics, which deals with regulation of financial system. Financial economics with similar, but financial economics deals with stock market, bonds market, this stuff. So monetary economics deals with banks, if to simplify, but financial economics deals with the stock market. So those things are different, and then even with on a principal level, I hope you can you know the difference. So there are banks that give loans, take deposits, and there are stock exchanges where you buy stocks. Those things are quite different. So monetary economics study banks, financial economics study stock markets. Banking study banks as well, but from a banking perspective. So monetary economics is from a government perspective. So Federal Reserve, heavily related to Federal Reserve activity in banking sector. Banking study actually how bank operates, like commercial bank. Another thing is investment management and business strategy are heavily based on macroeconomics, because although part of this, and in many cases, based on microeconomics, it's based on particular company, their performance and so on, but any investment strategy, any business decision should have, that's basically a weather forecast, should have analysis of the macroeconomic environment where this business seen to be successful or not. And we'll see in this course quite often you can check basically relatively basic, principal level, but we already can master some tools that will tell us, for example, looking ahead, that investing nowadays in clothing industry in US is not a good idea, while obviously computers and IT, finance, but also automobile construction is doing pretty well recently. So those type of ideas, they come not from knowing particular industry, because usually you can know only one industry well on micro level, but from understanding of macroeconomic, and you can see the breakdown of all the industries and their relative performance. So the first block is this financial business block. And again, if you ever want to be a head of department in any financial institution or higher than that, CEO of any company, you need macroeconomics. It's what you do every day. You come to work, you turn on the news, and you decompose whatever is said in the news with those misleading emotions and opinions, and you decompose to facts and actually analyze how those looks like very far away situation affect your particular business. And that's basically one of the key things of this course, is to give you these tools that you can do when you go further with your career and basically in any field. So international economics I mentioned already. Another thing that I didn't put in the slides is economic development. That's a field basically it's how developing countries operate in relationship to developed countries. So there are certain differences, and that is all also based a lot on macroeconomics, obviously, because we study the how countries operate, but just a subset of countries which are developing countries. They have certain specific things related to that. And the last one is political economy, which is we study policy and what government should do, not just about the economy. So if we come back to our definition, if macroeconomics study what government should do in relationship to the economy, political economy studies basically the same thing, but in a broader political perspective. And so to understand politics, you clearly should know macroeconomics very well, especially nowadays when we have major issues, major changes in very fundamental economic things. So, if we go back 20 years ago, this course would be really boring and would be really hard for me to teach, and I would probably choose to teach it because there was nothing so important going on as it is now from macroeconomic perspective. Now we have turn on trade. I mentioned already, we have major issues like fundamental issues with trade, fundamental issues with our employment and immigration related to that. We have fundamental issues with the environment. All those things are critical to us and are new. 20 years ago, there was nothing to discuss basically, unless some small things that are not that interesting. So welcome to the course, and hope you will learn a lot and you're excited to learn further.